An early return home was supposed to be a gift. For Ethan, a control-obsessed architect, it was a sentence. He came back from Germany to surprise the woman he loved. The surprise, however, was waiting for him. In the quiet sanctuary they called a bedroom, Ethan didn't find an embrace. He found the truth, that his masterpiece, the life he meticulously designed, was a complete fabrication, and his world wasn't crumbling. It was already in ruins. But a man's collapse is never the end of the story. It's the violent starting point. It's the journey that begins in the quiet of the rubble to face the most fundamental question of all. When everything that defined you is reduced to dust, who truly are you? The journey we're about to explore is about that question. It's a story that crosses borders because the pain of betrayal and the strength of rebuilding are universal. And before we dive deep, I'd like to know where in the world you're connecting with this story. Please leave the name of your country in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss any part of this journey. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the perfect world Ethan believed he had built. There's a dangerous illusion in solidity. We, as human beings, are programmed to trust what seems stable, what we can touch and measure. We believe that what is heavy, planned, and visibly strong is immune to collapse. No one believed this more firmly than Ethan. For him, it wasn't a belief, it was a law of physics, a truth etched in steel and concrete. His life was a reflection of his drafting table. From his office on the 40th floor, in the pulsing heart of Chicago, he saw the city as a testament to the power of design. He could smell paper and strong coffee, feel the roughness of a freshly printed blueprint under his fingers, and saw his own ambition reflected in the steel that rose against the sky. He didn't just design buildings, he built certainties for his clients and for himself. His motto was simple and absolute: structure is truth, everything else is just noise. Naturally, his marriage to Chloe was, in his mind, his masterpiece. A decade-long union, built on what he considered to be the purest of grounds: mutual trust and a meticulously planned future. He remembered one specific night, a few months prior, when they were on their apartment balcony, watching the Navy Pier lights shimmering over Lake Michigan. With a glass of wine in his hand, he drew in the air the plans for a future trip to Italy. Chloe laughed, that sound that for him was the acoustics of happiness, and said, "You always think of everything, don't you?" With a smile that he, in his blind confidence, interpreted as admiration. For a moment, he noticed a fleeting, unreadable glint in her eyes, but quickly dismissed it as a mere reflection of the city lights. To their circle of friends, they were the gold standard, the couple who validated everyone's belief in lasting love. Their life was a symphony of sophisticated normalcy. Dinner parties where the wine was always just right, weekend trips that seemed lifted from magazines, and a partnership that exuded an unwavering calm. Ethan saw their relationship as a perfectly symmetrical building. He never bothered to look for cracks, because he was absolutely convinced there were none. The trip was just another test of that structure's integrity. A prestigious project in Frankfurt, which could define his career internationally, would require him to stay in Germany for a month. For Ethan, the separation wasn't a threat, but an affirmation. A supporting beam doesn't fear the weight, and a solid love doesn't fear distance. It was an opportunity to prove, to himself, the strength of what he and Chloe had built together. The goodbye at O'Hare Airport was, therefore, serene. There was no drama of uncertainty, only the calm of confidence. In the final embrace, he focused on her familiar scent, the aroma he had catalogued in his mind as home. "I'll take care of everything here," she promised with a smile that left no room for doubt. And in fact, she was being perfectly sincere. Ethan boarded that plane with the tranquility of an architect who had inspected every pillar of his life and found not a single flaw. He didn't know, and how could he have known, that it's not earthquakes that topple the strongest structures. The true demolition begins much earlier, in the silence, with the invisible corrosion of the foundation, at the exact moment the architect turns his back. It all started with a gift disguised as a problem. A phone call in Frankfurt, a supply chain failure, and the sudden gift of 2 weeks off. For Ethan, the architect's mind was already designing the perfect surprise for Chloe. He relished the idea, imagining her smile when she saw him at the door. An unexpected return that would break the planned monotony of their life with a rare and welcome touch of spontaneity. The flight across the Atlantic was a countdown to joy. The trip from the airport home, a journey through quiet, familiar streets, felt like the last stage of a sacred pilgrimage back to the center of his universe. When the taxi stopped, he saw his house, dark and asleep, and next to it, the house of Julian, his neighbor and one of his closest friends. Julian's lights were also out. Ethan smiled, thinking of the irony. He'd probably tell him the next day during a barbecue about how he managed to fool everyone with his return. The instant the key turned, a cold, stagnant air hit him. A sour smell of wine and a floral perfume that wasn't Chloe's. Ethan's mind searched for logical explanations, but something already felt fundamentally wrong. He turned on his phone's flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, beginning its brutal autopsy of the scene. The light stopped on the coffee table, illuminating empty bottles. And then, it found the black leather jacket thrown over his favorite armchair. Ethan's heart stopped. It wasn't just any jacket. It was Julian's jacket. He'd recognize it anywhere. He'd joked about how often Julian wore it. For a moment, confusion protected him from the horror. What was his neighbor's jacket doing in his living room? The question hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. The light slid to the floor and found the wedding photo frame with shattered glass, and the protection of confusion began to crumble. The hallway to the bedroom became an endless tunnel, with each step a new, terrible possibility crystallizing in his mind. He saw flashes of memory. Julian in his kitchen, laughing with Chloe. Julian borrowing a tool. Julian waving from across the fence. Each image, once a pillar of his perfect suburban life, now twisted into something grotesque. The need to know became a physical force, pushing him forward. His hand landed on the bedroom doorknob. Cold. Final. He pushed the door open. The beam of light swept across the room and landed on the bed. And the world disintegrated. Chloe, sleeping on her side. And, nestled against her, with his arm possessively over her waist, was Julian. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an anonymous intruder. It was the face of his friend, the man he shared beers and confidences with, the man whose house he saw from his office window. The scene didn't have the fury of passion, but the calm of routine. This wasn't a slip-up. It was an arrangement. It was a conspiracy. The air left his lungs in a silent whoosh. His body didn't feel anger, didn't feel sadness. It only felt an absolute white emptiness. His knees buckled for an instant, and he had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. The betrayal wasn't a crack in the foundation. The entire foundation was the lie. He was looking at the ruins of his life, and the architect of the demolition was the man he called his friend. With a calm that would frighten him for months, he backed away. His feet moved backward, making no sound. His hand pulled the door, closing it with an almost inaudible click. He wasn't running away. He was retreating from the epicenter of a nuclear detonation to try and understand the scale of the radiation that had just contaminated every inch of his existence. Already outside, standing on the damp grass, looking at his house and then at the house next door, the architect finally understood the truth. His life wasn't a solid building with a structural flaw. It was a movie set, an elaborate facade. And the two people he trusted most in the world were the only ones who knew how hollow everything was behind it. Ethan doesn't remember getting into the car. He only remembers driving, with the familiar lights of his suburb blurring into an unrecognizable smear through the windshield. Every house with its lights on was an affront, a diorama of a normal life that was no longer his. He drove aimlessly, the car's engine a low hum that couldn't drown out the deafening silence in his head. It was a purposeless movement, a physical escape from a wound that was lodged in his soul. An architect's mind is a problem-solving machine, and Ethan's, in a panic, desperately tried to solve reality. He started drawing up blueprints of excuses. Julian and Chloe had too much to drink, and she helped him lie down. The jacket was forgotten from another day. The photo frame was knocked over by the cat. He created logical sequences, timelines of innocent events that could technically lead to that scene. They were perfect projects of denial, with one fatal flaw. He knew, deep in his soul, that they were a lie. Eventually, the fuel gauge started to drop, forcing him to stop. He couldn't go home. The word home had lost its meaning. He found a cheap motel on the side of the road, one of those anonymous places designed for temporary oblivion. The smell of disinfectant and loneliness in the room was almost a relief. It was a space without memories, a blank canvas. He sat on the edge of the bed, the rough synthetic fabric under his fingers, and stared at the bare wall. The contrast with his meticulously designed home was a cruel joke. It was then that he picked up his phone. With trembling fingers, he opened the photo gallery. Thousands of images of a life that, 2 hours ago, he believed was his. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for flaws. Like an inspector examining the blueprints of a collapsed building, he began to search for the crack he hadn't seen. He scrolled through photos from a trip to Rome, Chloe's smile in front of the Colosseum. He zoomed in on the image, searching her eyes for any sign, any hint of the facade. There was nothing, just the woman he loved. He kept scrolling, each photo a new torture. Her birthday the year before. A barbecue in the backyard, and there was Julian, in the background, laughing, with a beer in his hand. The image hit him with the force of a punch. The normalcy of the scene was what made it monstrous. He was there. He took the photo. The enemy was in his garden, eating his food, smiling for his camera. And he, the architect of control, saw absolutely nothing. The denial began to give way under the weight of the photographic evidence. The memory of Julian laughing merged with the image of Julian's arm over Chloe's waist. The memory of Julian's jacket was superimposed over dozens of photos where he was wearing it. The alternative realities his mind had built began to crumble, one by one, until only the naked, brutal truth remained, solid and undeniable as a concrete wall. "This can't be real," he whispered to the empty room, but the phrase sounded hollow, without conviction. The resistance was over. Acceptance, cold and sharp, began to seep in. He wasn't the victim of a misunderstanding. He was the protagonist of a catastrophe that he himself had refused to see, the resident of a condemned house who ignored all the signs. The pain had not yet arrived in its fullness. The anger was just a distant ember. But in the middle of that night, under the impersonal fluorescent light of a motel room, something else emerged from the ruins of denial. A chilling, precise, and frightening clarity. The architect's mind, free from the fog of sentimentality, began to do what it was trained to do when faced with an irredeemably compromised structure. It began to plan the demolition. The morning came not as a relief, but as a confirmation. The gray, merciless Chicago light seeped through the cheap motel curtain, illuminating the dust in the air and confirming that the night before had not been a nightmare. Reality was there, in the smell of old carpet, in the unmade bed where he had barely slept, and in the weight on his chest, which was now a physical, constant, and cold presence. The storm of shock and denial had passed, leaving behind a desolate landscape. It was in this desolation that something changed. The pain didn't go away, nor did the sadness. They were simply set aside, compartmentalized by a part of his mind that woke up with a singular purpose. It was the architect's mind, the facet of Ethan that didn't deal with emotions, but with problems. And what he had in front of him was the biggest structural problem of his life. An entire building had collapsed. The morning would come later. First, he needed to secure the area and call in the engineers. He sat on the bed, his phone in his hand. For a moment, the screen lit up with a photo of Chloe smiling, the wallpaper image of a world that no longer existed. With a slow, deliberate movement, his thumb pressed the side button until the screen went dark. It was his first act of demolition, erasing her face. His mind wasn't in the past, but in the protocol. What's the first step in a controlled demolition? You don't start with a sledgehammer. You start with a blueprint, a strategy. You consult an expert. And in his life, for this kind of problem, there was only one name: David. David wasn't just his lawyer. He was his best friend since college. The best man at his wedding. The man who knew all his versions. Calling him was more than a professional act. It was a confession of failure. It was admitting to the person who admired him most that the perfect structure he was so proud of building was, and perhaps always had been, a fraud. This call would make everything irreversible. It would be the sound of the siren that announced the official start of the demolition work. He stared at the name David on the screen for a full minute. Each second was a battle between wounded pride and the cold necessity to act. Then, with a slow exhale, he pressed the call button. The sound of the phone ringing in the quiet room was absurdly loud, each ring a step of no return. 1, 2. On the third, his friend's sleepy, familiar voice answered. "Ethan? It's 6 in the morning. Is everything okay?" Ethan closed his eyes. His voice, when it came out, wasn't that of a broken man. It was that of a client, of an engineer reporting a catastrophic failure. Calm, precise, and completely devoid of emotion. "David, it's me. I need help. The worst kind." David's office was a sanctuary of order. Perfectly aligned law books, a polished mahogany desk, the soft smell of coffee and paper. It was a world Ethan understood. Sitting in a leather chair, with the first morning light coming through the window, he narrated the events of the previous night. His voice was that of a man describing a car accident he watched from a distance, not one that hit him head-on. David listened in silence, shock and compassion etched on his face. When Ethan finished, David remained silent for a moment. "Okay," he said, his voice firm, the lawyer's voice taking control. "The first practical step, before anything else, is to protect you. We need to get a complete view of your finances and freeze everything that's joint. Now." It was logical advice, the kind of action Ethan's architect mind appreciated, a protocol for disaster. Ethan nodded, opening his laptop on David's desk, a routine gesture that, on that day, seemed to carry the weight of a sentence. He navigated to the bank portal, typed in his username and password, and pressed enter. The page reloaded with a small red box. "Access denied." He frowned. An error. He tried again. The same red box. A different kind of cold, sharper than the one from the night before, began to climb up his spine. He looked at David, who understood the implication in the same instant. This wasn't a technical error. It was a locked door. A changed lock. Chloe hadn't just committed an act of betrayal. She had taken a premeditated step to cut him off from his own life. The conspiracy had layers. David took over, making a call to his contact at the bank. While he waited, the silence in the office was thick. Ethan stared at his laptop's dark screen, a monument to his own naivety. He, the man who designed security systems for entire buildings, had been locked out of his own financial home by a changed password. "Got it," David said, turning his monitor toward Ethan. "The last 3 months of statements." The page loaded. A long list of black and white transactions that were the autopsy of his marriage. It wasn't a single large withdrawal. It was worse. It was the normalcy of the plundering, painting a portrait of a life he had no idea he was financing. The dates were like daggers, each transaction corresponding to one of his business trips. And then he saw the detail that made the air grow thin. The payment to an interior design office. In the invoice description, a single, terrible word. Nursery. For a second, Ethan's mind froze. Nursery? They weren't trying to have kids. Chloe had said she wanted to wait. Was it a gift for her sister who was pregnant? His logical architect's mind clung to this plausible explanation, but the seed of an unspeakable horror was planted. Next to that expense, the list continued. Each item a new insult. A subscription to a golf club he knew was Julian's favorite. Recurring purchases at a specialty wine store his friend always raved about. Direct debits for a car payment he had never seen in the garage. The truth hit him with the force of a mallet. Julian wasn't just the lover. He was a dependent. The friendship was a disguise for an infiltration. The final blow was near the top of the most recent statement. A transfer of $50,000, made 3 days before his return. It didn't look like an expense, but an investment. A down payment on a property? It was the money they would use to build their nest with the bricks he had manufactured. Ethan leaned back in the chair, the air leaving his lungs. He looked at David's shocked face but barely registered it. The pain of the emotional betrayal was just the initial tremor. The real earthquake was this. He hadn't just been betrayed, he had been systematically looted. They hadn't just broken his heart. They had emptied him out. And for the first time since the bedroom door opened, the architect looked at the future and saw no blueprints, no strategy, only an empty lot where his life used to be. The air in David's office felt thin. The walls lined with books, which once represented order and security, now seemed to close in on Ethan, a tomb for his past life. He looked at the numbers on David's monitor, but no longer saw transactions. He saw the rubble of his trust, the irrefutable proof of his own colossal naivety. The feeling wasn't anger, but an overwhelming powerlessness. "Ethan," David began, the friend's voice showing through the lawyer's mask. "This is premeditated. They cornered you. We're going to fight, but I have to be honest, getting that money back will be a trench war. Long, expensive, and dirty." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his hope. He had been methodically drained, left without resources for the battle ahead. David continued to talk about motions and the difficulty of proving financial abuse, trying to manage expectations. They cleaned out the joint accounts, but they can't take everything. Your retirement funds, personal investments, everything that was legally yours before Chloe, is protected. The word "before" cut through the white noise in Ethan's mind like lightning. Not the superficial "before" of his marriage, but a much deeper "before" of another house, another life. And with that word, a dusty memory came to the surface. The image of his mother, the weight of the will papers in his hands, and his father's voice, an even older memory, advising him about finances. What you build, you can divide. What you inherit, you protect. Always. The inheritance. The money his mother left him. He had used it to buy the house, years before he even met Chloe. The down payment, he remembered now, was a direct transfer from the estate account. He remembered David, a newly graduated lawyer at the time, handling all the paperwork. A detail. A single detail forgotten in the blueprint of his life. The fog in his mind dissipated, replaced by a spark of electric clarity. He looked up from the floor, focusing on his friend. His voice came out low, almost a whisper, but sharp as glass. "David, the house documents, the deed. When we closed on it, in what name was it registered?" David frowned for a second, and then his eyes widened in understanding. He got up abruptly and went to a huge metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. The drawers opened with a metallic sound. His fingers flipped through old folders until he pulled one out, thick and yellowed with time. He threw it on the table, opening it in a hurry until he found what he was looking for: the property deed. He looked at the document, and then at Ethan, a slow, incredulous smile forming on his face. "My God," David said. "It's just yours. Exclusive property. It was bought with inheritance funds, classified as a prenuptial asset." He tapped his finger on the paper. "Ethan, the house is yours. All yours. She can't touch it." Those words didn't bring joy. They didn't bring relief. They brought something much more dangerous: power. The empty lot Ethan saw in his future suddenly had a single structure standing, intact, right in the center. The chessboard flipped. He wasn't in checkmate. In fact, he owned the board. They hadn't taken his castle. They were just living in it as illegal tenants. The architect within him woke up. But it wasn't the idealistic builder from before. It was something older, colder. It was the demolition expert. Ethan's mind began to work with a terrifying speed and precision, no longer sketching a defense plan, but a ruthless project of attack. He looked at David, and the broken man from that morning had disappeared. In his place was a client with steel eyes. "They made a fundamental miscalculation," Ethan said, his voice resonating with a deadly calm. "They thought the war was about the money in the walls. But they forgot the first rule of architecture." David stared at him, holding his breath. "The foundation is everything," Ethan continued. "And the foundation of that house is mine." The man who sat in the chair across from David was no longer the same one who had entered his office that morning. The fog of shock had dissipated, replaced by a crystalline and dangerous focus. The pain hadn't disappeared. It had simply been converted into energy, a high-octane fuel for the machine that had just awakened. Ethan was no longer the victim. He was the client. And he had a project. "I want them out of my house," Ethan said, his voice low and without inflection. "I want them out today." David, still processing the sudden reversal of power, blinked. "Ethan, legally, that takes time. An eviction notice can take weeks." "No," Ethan interrupted, the word sharp as a blade. "You're the lawyer. Find the fastest way. Is there an emergency clause? A loophole? Use it. I don't care about the cost. I want the law to be a sledgehammer, not a scalpel." He leaned forward, and for the first time, David saw a glint in his friend's eyes that he had never seen before. The cold light of absolute certainty. What followed wasn't a conversation, but a war strategy session. For a single intense afternoon, the law office became a command center. Ethan, the architect, was back in his element, but the project was different. He wasn't building. He was systematically dismantling a life, and he did it with a precision and speed that left David, a lawyer experienced in litigious battles, astonished. First, the finances. With proof of ownership of the house and the evidence of the financial plundering, David managed to get the bank, in an extraordinary measure, to freeze all joint credit cards and accounts, citing fraudulent activity by one of the account holders. The faucet ran dry. Ethan watched the email confirmation arrive. His face remained a mask of neutrality, but inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of power. It wasn't joy. It was the cold, precise satisfaction of an architect who has just pressed the detonator and knows, with absolute certainty, that his calculations were correct. Next, the assets. While David prepared the paperwork, Ethan, on his own laptop, methodically transferred every remaining cent of his personal investments and retirement funds to a new bank account, at a new bank, opened online in a matter of minutes. He built a financial wall around himself, leaving the territory they had invaded completely sterile. Every click of the mouse was a brick being laid in his new fortress. Finally, the legal offense. David, driven by Ethan's relentless urgency, drafted and electronically filed the divorce petition, citing adultery and misappropriation of funds. Simultaneously, he prepared an emergency eviction order based on Ethan's exclusive legal ownership and the fact that the current occupants represented a continuous risk to his assets. It was an aggressive legal maneuver, but the evidence was overwhelming. At 4 p.m, everything was done. In a single afternoon, Ethan had effectively erased Chloe from his financial and legal life. He stood up, his body moving with a fluidity he hadn't felt since the night before. The powerlessness had been purged, replaced by a chilling purpose. "The bailiff confirmed," David said, hanging up the phone. "He can meet us at your house in an hour to serve the notice." Ethan just nodded. He walked to the office door, stopping with his hand on the knob. "David," he said without turning around. "Thank you. For everything." "Ethan, are you sure you want to do this? Be there?" David asked, a final attempt to appeal to the man he knew, not the strategist he had become. Ethan turned around slowly, and the look on his face was that of an architect inspecting the site of a scheduled demolition. "I have to," he said, his voice calm and firm. "I drew up the blueprint. I want to see the walls come down." The trip back to his street felt nothing like the previous ones. There was no happy anticipation of a man returning home, nor the disoriented agony of a betrayed husband. This time, it was the trip of a sovereign returning to reclaim his territory. David's car was in front, and behind them, the discreet vehicle of the bailiff. It was a solemn and silent procession, a force of legal invasion about to take back what was his. Ethan kept his hands on the steering wheel, his body steady, his mind clear as ice. When they parked, the scene was one of surreal normalcy. Kids riding bikes, a neighbor mowing his lawn. No one knew that this quiet street was about to become the stage for an unconditional surrender. He got out of the car, his body moving with deliberate fluidity, and joined David and the officer on the sidewalk. They walked together to the front door, 3 figures with a singular purpose. For Ethan, each step on the grass he himself had once planted was an act of reclamation. The bailiff knocked on the door. The sound, dry and authoritative, echoed in the stillness of the late afternoon. Seconds passed. Then, the door opened. Chloe appeared, a casual smile on her face, which froze the instant she saw the trio standing on her doorstep. Her eyes passed by David, landed on the officer's uniform, and finally met Ethan's. Her smile didn't just disappear. It disintegrated, replaced by a mask of confusion and growing panic. Julian appeared behind her, with an expression of curiosity that quickly turned into hostility. "What is this?" he asked, his voice arrogant. The officer, ignoring him, stepped forward and handed Chloe the documents. "Ma'am, you are being served with an emergency eviction order and a divorce petition." The words hung in the air, precise and devastating. Ethan watched Julian's gaze shift from the papers to Chloe's panicked face, and he didn't see a supportive lover, but the rapid calculation of a rat on a sinking ship. The initial hostility disappeared, replaced by the fury of an investor whose asset had just turned to dust. Ethan watched impassively. He focused on Chloe's face. He saw the color drain from her skin, her eyes widening in pure and absolute terror. He saw her hand tremble. He saw the exact moment the reality of the situation hit her. The game was over. The power had shifted. That look of abject panic, of a queen who suddenly finds herself a prisoner in her own castle, was Ethan's first victory. It wasn't a victory that brought joy. It was a victory that brought a dark, chilling satisfaction. It was the confirmation that his calculations were correct, that the power structure they had built was, in fact, an illusion. He had found the fatal flaw in their blueprint and was now exploiting it to the fullest. He was, once again, the architect in control. "Ethan, what are you doing? We can talk," Chloe said, her voice a thread of desperation. Julian took a step forward, but stopped under the officer's severe gaze. Ethan didn't give them a single word. His silence was his most potent weapon, an impenetrable wall that denied them any access, any negotiation. He turned to the moving crew that had just arrived. "You can start," he ordered, his voice calm and firm. What followed was the surgical dismantling of a life. The men entered the house and, under Ethan's precise direction, began to remove only his belongings. He pointed, commanded, while Chloe and Julian were forced to watch, helpless, as the house was reconfigured around them, transforming into a place that no longer contained him. Each item removed was a small victory. The watch his father gave him, the armchair where he used to read, the blueprints he himself had drawn and framed. He was extracting his own history from that house, leaving behind only the scene of their crime. It was a silent, methodical, and complete humiliation. When they finished, Ethan took one last look inside, at Chloe and Julian, standing in the middle of the rearranged room, looking like two lost figures in a foreign land. Without a word of farewell, he turned and walked back to his car. The door closed behind him, the final and definitive sound. As he drove away, he saw in the rearview mirror his house door close, trapping them inside with the consequences of their actions. He had won. He had retaken his territory with the precision of a general. But the satisfaction he expected was fleeting, quickly replaced by a cold and empty echo. He realized that the victory hadn't brought him peace. It had only confirmed the most devastating truth. He didn't fight to save his home. He fought for a piece of property. And now, with the deed in his pocket and his belongings in a truck, he was, for the first time in his life, officially homeless. The first offensive of the new war didn't arrive with a legal notice, but with the incessant buzzing of a cell phone. The next morning, in the temporary hotel room that had become his refuge, Ethan woke up to an avalanche of messages and notifications. And on top of everything, a post tagged by dozens of people. It was from Chloe, and it was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The photo she chose was of herself, with a sad look, sitting amidst boxes, in the house he had just partially dismantled. The text was a symphony of half-truths and poisonous omissions. She spoke of Ethan's sudden and terrifying mental collapse, of erratic and controlling behavior, and the pain of being expelled from her own home without warning. She didn't mention Julian. She didn't mention the money. She didn't mention the betrayal. She painted herself as the devoted victim of an unstable man. Ethan felt his blood run cold as he scrolled through the comments. There were dozens, then hundreds. Mutual friends, neighbors, even distant relatives, all offering a chorus of support and compassion to her. "Stay strong, honey. We're with you. I can't believe he did that." Each word was a brick being removed from his reputation, a public demolition of his character. The battle then became personal. Direct messages started coming in. Worse still, her campaign began to leak into the professional world. He saw a comment from someone he didn't know on his architectural firm's review page. "Would you hire an architect who kicks his own wife out of the house? I think not." Says a lot about his character. That comment, small and anonymous, hit him differently. It wasn't an attack on the husband, but on the builder, on his brand, on the foundation of his professional life. Anger, for the first time since the discovery, surged with full force, a pure, white fury that urged him to react. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, ready to type the truth, to expose the lie with the force of the bank statements. He wanted to scream to the digital world, "She was with our neighbor. They stole my money. The nursery she was planning wasn't for a child of ours." But David's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't get in the mud with her. It's what she wants." And then the architect took over. He looked at the situation not with his heart, but with the mind of a strategist. Chloe was a master of a specific battlefield, that of emotion and public opinion. Fighting there would be fighting on her territory, with her weapons. A battle in the mud has no winners, only dirty players. The real victory, he realized, wasn't in fighting. It was in refusing to play the game. And so, with a calm that surprised even himself, he began his silent counteroffensive. First, he deactivated his social media accounts. With one click, the main battlefield disappeared. Next, he blocked, one by one, the numbers of the friends who had judged him without giving him the benefit of the doubt. It was an act of defensive architecture. He was building a new foundation, not of concrete, but of peace. He was drawing the new borders of his life, and the rule was simple. Whoever brings chaos doesn't get in. To his family and to David, he sent a single calm message explaining the truth and concluded with, "I will not participate in this public circus. I trust the legal process." In the days that followed, a deep silence settled in Ethan's life. It was the quiet of an abandoned battlefield. The digital storm continued to rage somewhere distant, but he was no longer there to hear it. By refusing to fight her war, on her terms, he had won. He had protected what was left of his sanity. The peace he felt was real, earned not by retaliation, but by discipline and self-control. He had cut the ties, silenced the accusers, and clung to the logic of the law as his only compass. Looking at the future, for the first time in a long time, he didn't see an empty lot, but the chance for a new project, on a terrain that was finally clean. He took a deep breath, believing for the first time that the demolition had in fact ended. The weeks that followed the great battle were not filled with more drama, but with a profound, healing silence. With Chloe and Julian legally barred from contacting him and the noise of social media silenced, Ethan's life was reduced to a simple, monastic routine. He moved into a rented apartment downtown, an impersonal space with white walls and a view of the rooftops of other buildings. It was the opposite of the home he had, and for that very reason, it was perfect. The first step to true liberation was putting the house up for sale. The act of signing the papers with the real estate agent was devoid of emotion. That place, which had once been the center of his universe, the ultimate symbol of his successful life, had become just an asset on a spreadsheet. Seeing it online, photographed with its empty rooms, didn't bring him a pang of nostalgia, but an unexpected sense of lightness. It was the last anchor holding him to a toxic past, and he was eager to cut it. In his new apartment, he surrounded himself with only the essentials: his books, his music, his drafting table. It was an environment that contained no ghosts. While unpacking one last box, he found a small ceramic object Chloe had given him years ago. He held it in his hand, expecting to feel the familiar stab of anger or pain, but felt nothing. It was just a thing, an artifact from a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. And in this void of feeling, he found not loneliness, but clarity. Slowly, his creative passion began to return, but in a different way. On quiet nights, he would find himself sketching, not for clients, but for himself. The projects weren't of large family homes, but of a small, functional house for one man. A structure integrated with nature, with lots of natural light and no unnecessary spaces. He was no longer designing a monument to impress the world, but a sanctuary to house his own peace. The weeks turned into a month, and the silence that had once been deafening became his most faithful companion. The divorce process was running in the background, a distant hum managed by David. The house was under contract to be sold. Standing in his new apartment, watching the city lights come on, Ethan felt the calm of an architect in front of a clean, leveled lot, ready for the first draft of a new foundation. He allowed himself a sigh of relief, convinced that, finally, the earth had stopped shaking. In the quiet of his new apartment, Ethan had started to believe in peace. Routine was his meditation. Breakfast in the morning sun, long hours of focused work, nights sketching the small house that would be his future. The sale of the old residence was almost complete. The divorce process was moving forward smoothly. He had survived the demolition and was, for the first time, inspecting a clean lot, ready to rebuild himself. It was in this hard-won silence that the phone rang. It was David. His friend's tone wasn't that of a lawyer reporting routine progress. There was an urgency, a gravity that made Ethan's stomach clench instantly. "Ethan, I need you to sit down," David said. And with that phrase, the ground beneath Ethan's feet began to shake again. "We just received an emergency motion from Chloe's lawyer," David continued, his voice tense. "They're asking for the immediate suspension of the entire divorce process and your assets." Ethan frowned, confused. "Based on what?" he asked, the architect's mind already searching for the logic. David's answer was the demolition charge he could never have predicted. "Chloe is pregnant, and she claims the child is yours." Ethan's first reaction was a short, bitter, incredulous laugh. "That's impossible, David. It's ridiculous." His logical mind fired, calculating dates, timelines. He was in Germany. It was a cynical lie, the dirtiest card of a player who had already lost the game. He felt a wave of contempt, but not fear. The lie was too obvious. "I thought so too," David said, his voice dropping. "But the motion is specific, Ethan. It cites a date. A night, a few days before your trip to Frankfurt. She claims it was a reconciliation attempt." A heavy silence fell on the line. Ethan's mind went back to that night. He remembered it. It was strange, distant, but it happened. Suddenly, Chloe's impossible lie found a crack of plausibility to seep into. And then, like a ghost, the memory of the bank statement returned to haunt him. The word he tried to forget, which his logical mind had filed away as an anomaly. Nursery. That payment to the design firm, the seed of horror planted weeks ago, instantly germinated into an overwhelming panic. It wasn't a gift for her sister. It was a plan of which he was now the central target. The cold clarity that had guided him in recent weeks shattered, replaced by a chaos of emotions he wasn't prepared to face. He wondered what kind of desperation would lead someone to use a child as a weapon. And for the first time, a terrible voice in his mind whispered, "The kind of desperation you yourself helped build?" This wasn't about money. It wasn't about a house. It was about a life that, if it were his, would forever chain him to Chloe. It was the perfect trap. Chloe had found the only blind spot in his new fortress. He had built walls to protect his assets and his peace, but there was no defense against an attack on his conscience. If he fought the claim, he would forever be the monster who disowned his own child. If he gave in, he would be her perpetual prisoner, the sponsor of the family she built with another man. He hung up the phone, but the silence of his apartment was no longer peaceful. It was the suffocating quiet of an interrogation room. The demolition he thought had ended had started again, but this time the explosives were planted in his soul. The question was no longer about architecture or revenge. It was about biology and morality. Looking at the sketches of his new house, the house for a single man, he saw the lines curve and distort into something unrecognizable. The architect was, once again, lost, with no blueprint and no foundation, facing the only structure he didn't know how to build or how to demolish, that of a family born of the most perfect and cruel of lies. The mediation room was a deliberately neutral space. Beige walls, a long, polished wooden table, and a total absence of character. It was the perfect setting for the final dissection of a life. On one side, Ethan and David, quiet and focused. On the other, Chloe, her lawyer, and Julian, whose presence radiated an arrogant impatience. Ethan didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the mediator, a woman with an impassive expression. He wasn't the panicked man. He was the architect who had arrived for the final inspection. The meeting began with legal formalities, a dance of jargon that barely masked the brutal tension in the room. Chloe's lawyer reiterated the motion, speaking of the pregnancy and the presumption of paternity. David, with a glacial calm, responded that his client contested the claim and that before any discussion, he demanded the presentation of the result of the prenatal paternity test performed the previous week. The mediator, who already had the envelope in her hands, nodded. Time seemed to slow down. Every sound in the room became sharp. The click of a pen, Chloe's breathing, the sound of paper being torn. Ethan felt his heart pound, not with fear, but with a terrible anticipation. It was the moment the last and most important supporting beam of this lie would be tested to the breaking point. The mediator cleared her throat and read the conclusion of the report in a monotonous, professional voice. The comparative DNA analysis conclusively excludes Mr. Ethan Hayes as the biological father. A deep, heavy silence fell over the room. It was the silence of a universe that had just become extinct. David let out a slow sigh of relief. Chloe's face simply fell apart. But it was Julian's reaction that captured Ethan's attention. There was no shock, no compassion. There was only the cold fury of a gambler who had just lost the final bet. He turned to Chloe, his voice a poisonous whisper. "You told me there was a chance. You screwed everything up." Without another word, he got up, straightened his jacket, and left the room, abandoning her in the midst of the rubble he had helped create. Chloe's lawyer, seeing the lost battle, began to gather his papers. The room began to empty until only two people were left sitting on opposite sides of the long table: Ethan and Chloe. The architect and the ruin. It was she who broke the silence. Without tears, her voice hoarse and empty. "It was perfect," she said, looking at her own hands. "Your house was perfect. Your trips were perfect. Our dinners were perfect. It was your perfect life project, Ethan." She finally lifted her eyes, and in them, he saw not malice, but an abyssal emptiness. "And I was just the prettiest piece of decoration." For the first time, Ethan heard not the liar, not the betrayer, but the woman he never bothered to get to know. She spoke of the overwhelming loneliness of living inside a plan, the suffocation of having every step, every choice, every future already drawn out by him. About how Julian, with all his flaws, was the first man in years who asked her what she wanted. "The irony, Ethan?" she whispered, the final and most tragic confession. The money was never the prize. It was just the building material. The prize was to blow up your perfect world, just so you would finally see me in the rubble. The truth, in all its ugly and painful complexity, was finally on the table. Ethan listened to every word. The anger he expected to feel didn't come. The satisfaction of victory evaporated. In its place, only a sad and profound clarity remained. He remembered the question he asked himself, the kind of desperation you yourself helped build. The answer was right in front of him. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't the only victim. They were both architects of that disaster. He got up. There was nothing more to be said. He looked at her one last time, not as an enemy, but as a stranger with whom he had once shared a life. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement. And then he turned and left the room, leaving her behind forever. In the silence of the elevator going down, Ethan felt the weight of all his victories. He was legally free, financially secure, morally vindicated. He had won on all fronts. So why did he feel so incredibly heavy? The demolition was complete, but he realized that the reconstruction wouldn't be about raising new walls. It would be about learning to live with the ghosts that now inhabited the empty lot. The weeks that followed the mediation had no more twists and turns. They had only the silent bureaucracy of the end. The act of signing the final divorce papers in David's office was strangely anticlimactic. There was no catharsis, no relief, just the sound of the pen sliding over the paper, the black ink formalizing the dissolution of a decade of his life. Each signature was a final sledgehammer blow, demolishing the last legal beam that still connected them. Shortly after the sale of the house was finalized, Ethan met with the new owners, a young couple with the same sparkle of hope in their eyes that he and Chloe once had. He handed them the keys to the place he had designed, built, and fought so hard for. As he walked away, he didn't look back. That piece of property, the battlefield of his greatest victory, was no longer his, and its loss freed him. David briefly told him what he had heard about the consequences for Chloe. Without financial support and abandoned by Julian, she had left the city, returning to her parents' house in another state. There was no schadenfreude in Ethan's heart, no joy in her ruin. There was only a gray sadness for the mutual destruction they had caused. She was now a ghost, an architect of a disaster that had consumed her as well. And so, the war ended. Ethan was officially free. The house, sold. The divorce, finalized. Chloe and Julian, gone from his life. He had won. He had regained control, protected his future, and came out on the other side. However, what was left in the place of the battle's adrenaline was not the euphoria of victory, but a profound fatigue, which seemed to have seeped into his bones. With the divorce papers signed and the house keys handed over, the last echo of the war fell silent. He was free, completely, unconditionally free. But as he sat in his apartment that night, feeling a weariness that seemed older than the betrayal itself, freedom didn't feel light. It felt vast, silent, and a little scary. The demolition had been a project that consumed every ounce of his energy. Now, in front of the empty lot of his life, he faced a new and more difficult task. That of an architect without a blueprint, having to learn for the first time to build not for the future, but for the now. 6 months passed. The dense, heavy air of Chicago was replaced by the crisp, salty breeze of Seattle. Ethan now lived in an apartment with a large window that framed the serene view of Puget Sound. He had opened his own architectural studio, a small minimalist space, where the only projects he accepted were those that brought him peace. The man who moved through this new space was visibly different, lighter, more authentic, with a smile that was no longer designed, but genuine. On a Saturday morning, as he drank his coffee looking at the water, his phone vibrated with a discreet message from David. It wasn't about the divorce, which was already finalized, but a small postscript to the life he had left behind. David briefly mentioned that Chloe was struggling and that the child needed specific, expensive medical care. There was no request, just the sharing of information. The old Ethan would have felt anger, or perhaps a vengeful satisfaction. The new Ethan, however, read the message, took a sip of coffee, and thought for a moment. He didn't think of Chloe, or Julian, or the betrayal. He thought only of an innocent child. He typed a simple response to David. Create an anonymous fund. Take care of it. Make sure she never knows where it came from. He pressed send and returned to looking at the landscape. It wasn't an act of forgiveness, nor of reconciliation. It was an act of strength. The final proof that he had rebuilt himself so solidly that a gesture of compassion could no longer shake his foundations. This was the fundamental difference. The old Ethan built walls to protect himself from the world. The new Ethan had built an inner foundation so strong that he no longer needed walls. He could afford to be compassionate because his peace no longer depended on external factors. His self-worth was no longer a project to be admired, but an internal structure that quietly sustained him. The final scene takes us to his studio, later that night. The room is silent, except for the sound of a pencil gliding over paper. Ethan is hunched over his drafting table, his face serene and focused under the warm light of the lamp. He's not working for a client. He's designing his own house. A small, functional project, full of natural light, perfectly integrated into the Pacific Northwest landscape. His face turns to the camera, to us, and the narration begins, not with the voice of the narrator, but with that of Ethan himself, the man who survived the demolition. I spent my life obsessed with solid foundations, thinking that security came from concrete and steel. When my ground gave way, I realized that the most important structure wasn't that of my house, but my own. The betrayal forced me to demolish everything I thought I was. And in the place of the rubble, I learned to build something much more valuable, my self-respect. His gaze returns to the drawing, a slight smile on his lips. Today, I no longer design houses to shelter facades of perfection. I design spaces to shelter peace. And mine, finally, is under construction.